just say some words to today's topic in general. So I guess the topic of the second day of the winter school is pretty clear, not only from the list of guests, but also from the title of the talks. And as you will see, also from the talk that is coming up now. To approach the issue of inequalities in digital practices on a global scale, it's pretty clear that we need a multidisciplinary and intersectional approach. So this involves considering the social, the political, the economic, the legal, the environmental, and the cultural factors that contribute to these inequalities, as well as the socio-technical systems and all the practices that reinforce them. So datafication, as we will see more specifically now, monitoring, and then later also mapping, are very powerful tools for understanding of those systems, but also intervening in such systems. And it's always a matter of representation and giving power to what is visible and what is not visible, what is computable and what is accountable. So it's also a matter of creating and maintaining large infrastructures and centers of calculation, often serving very specialized needs, as we will see, while exploiting and extracting resources and labor. And the question of what we make visible and what is visible with datafication is a question of perspective. So whether it is asked from the data center in the US, or from the platform for content moderation in the Philippines, or from a refugee boat in the Mediterranean. So the power of datafication is, amongst others, that of perspective and access. And our first keynote speaker will delve into this. So welcome, Monika Halkort. Monika, thank you so much for filling in for Milagros. It's so great to have you as a participant of this winter school, but even better also to have you as a speaker here. If you allow me, I would like to briefly introduce you. We know each other for quite some time. And Monika, you are currently a senior lecturer at the MA program, Applied Human Rights and the Arts at the University of Applied Arts in Vienna, Austria. And I guess this is a very important transdisciplinary perspective that we will have covered also by our next guest, Felix and Vladan. So it's actually a perfect fit to have you speaking here today. From 2013 to 2020, you were assistant professor of digital media and social communication at the Lebanese American University in Beirut, Lebanon. And since many years, I followed that quite a bit, you do research on the political and moral economy of digital infrastructures and datafication. We are emphasizing in particular the material entanglements of these techno-scientific instrument platforms and colonial knowledge regimes. You have published about your work in various outlets, and you have also co-organized lots of interesting events around these topics. I will share some of the links later during your keynote. And you can also look back on a wonderful journalistic career, especially here in Austria, working amongst many others for my favorite radio show, Radio Kolleg, at the radio station 1, doing really great feature series in a very interesting format. So I'm really, really happy that you agreed to share your work with us on such short notice. Thank you, Monika. And please, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you. Can you hear me all okay? Okay, nice. I can't see the slide presentation, but I think it's fine. I can see you, and so we should be fine. Well, thank you for this very nice and generous introduction, Katja, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you and share my work and thoughts with you. And like Katja already announced, what I'm presenting here is really the last chapter of a series of papers I've conducted during my time in Lebanon and during the transition here back to Austria, where I really interrogated how digital infrastructures and datafication affect the way ethical commitments and obligations are enacted and operationalized. And most of this work has been built around a series of case studies on real-time mapping technologies and machine sensing for the purpose of policing and surveillance on one hand, but also activism in support of irregular migrants in the Mediterranean Sea. And I think with this orientation, the work resonates quite nicely with Lynette Taylor's talk yesterday, where she really emphasized the topic of today, for one, visibility, invisibility, but also what Lynette Taylor emphasized yesterday with regards to the question of legitimacy of digital infrastructures, where she pointed to the ways data and algorithmic architectures in this tendency to aggregate and accumulate and recompose data fragments in an ongoing process of looping and recalibration really take on state-like or institutional decisional authority in their own right with regards to decisions of inclusion, exclusion, visibility, invisibility, but also protection and care, in particular in the context of the public good. And so in my work, I follow a similar trajectory, but I'm interested in the wider question of the onto-epistemic or the material semiotic work in this process, and look at how digital infrastructures produce objects and bodies in a quite literal sense, as addresses of legal and moral protection, and conversely also as objects of dehumanization, exclusion, or erasure from registers of recognition, attention, and visibility and care. And so in the first part of this series of works, I looked at the work of activists, particularly how activists mobilize remote sensing and tracking technologies, Earth observation satellites, but also mobile phone networks and drones to expose border violence and for the purpose of rescuing migrants against pushback operations in the Mediterranean Sea. And I compared these kind of rather more subversive or disobedient practices with the rationality of European states and the border security agency Frontex, most importantly, to show how the very same technologies can be used both to evade or to enforce responsibility to protect, rescue, and care. And so the main purpose of this work was really to show how the expansive field of visibility afforded by Earth observation satellites, tracking technologies, are weaponized on all fronts by activists and smugglers and security forces alike, in an ever more entrenched battle over unsolicited travelers arriving on European shores.
Monika,
and now
Monika, can I just briefly interrupt you, because we see your PowerPoint program, but we don't see the full slides. Do you maybe want to switch screens or start the screen presentation? Just sorry for that.
Okay. Now I understand.
Maybe you just start it again and you try to. Sorry for that.
The problem is if I make it full screen, if I go in presentation mode, I don't see my Zoom anymore. How is this?
If you want, you just do it like that, and I keep you informed. We will monitor the chat, and we can give you signs if there is something. So don't worry. If you want to, anyway, you might want to see your slides yourself. So don't worry about Zoom.
Okay. Okay, so now it's.
No, actually, it doesn't work for us. But don't worry, we will.
Do you see it now?
We see. Now we see it. Perfect. Yeah? Perfect.
Okay.
Thanks a lot. Sorry for interrupting.
No, not a problem. Now it works. This Zoom is somehow different from the versions I usually use. It doesn't matter. So now, in the final chapter of this research, which I summarize here, I wanted to draw out some wider conclusions to ask how we can understand these meta and meaning-making capacities of remote sensing and tracking technologies in relation to the wider ethico-political challenges of environmental destruction and ecological collapse today. It's in this relation to planetary crisis, I believe, where migrants left to die expose a critical limit and fault line in the ways digital infrastructures are currently mobilized in response to risk of death and extinction. And so in what follows, I want to further elaborate on these fault lines and suggest that they are indicative of a profound confusion about the way in which we distribute solidarities between humans and non-humans in the face of competing pressures, climate change, depleting energy resources, extreme weather events. And what I intend to show is how datification, machine sensing, and tracking technologies feed into this confusion and further diffract racialized logics of abandonment and exposure to premature death across species, strata, and scales. Climate change and the threat of mass extinction, as we very well know, have radically rearranged the calculus of rights, responsibilities, and obligations between humans and non-humans. It has ushered in a growing awareness of the collective reciprocities at stake in the entanglement of living and non-living beings, on which the future and survival of the planet depends. At the same time, with our entry into a new climatic regime, the global conditions for survival and the production and reproduction of life on Earth are changing. Not only can life on Earth no longer be taken for granted, the central concern for governing and administrating life are no longer the condition of its flourishing, but rather, to follow Mbembe, the conditions on which it ends. As Mbembe notes, population politics at a planetary scale will increasingly become synonymous with access and waste management, with what to do with those whose very existence doesn't seem to be necessary for our reproduction, or whose mere existence or proximity is deemed to represent a physical or biological threat. Implied here is a critical shift in the ethical and biopolitical imagination, where it was once the management of health, productivity, and self-sufficiency that sat at the heart of government. It is today the calculated distribution of death, decay, and extinction that directs population management. This is, of course, not to ignore that the values and meanings attached to life have always been subject to racialized distinctions that allowed for some lives to be abandoned or exposed to premature death in the first place. My point is rather to stress the shifting scales on which such risks are calculated and rationalized in the face of multiple overlapping pressures of depleting energy resources, loss of biodiversity, rising sea levels, industrial pollution, or global warming, to name just a few. As the folded temporalities of technofossils intermingle with biological and geological folds, long-standing assumptions of what sustains life and the conditions of its ending become ever more difficult to determine, just as the timeframes and scales of modeling them are becoming ever more contested and unclear. As Lehmann writes, the questions of securing certain forms of life is no longer confined to the figure of the human in its most basic biological features. It needs to respond to planetary scale environmental conditions, not as a predictable baseline, but as a source of potentiality and uncertainty that can no longer be easily mapped or known. Within this horizon of radical uncertainty, new challenges arise with regards to risk, sustainability, and epistemic justice. It puts new pressures on the long-standing question of how we become answerable to what we know and how we see. To recall, epistemic justice in its most broadest sense concerns itself with the problem of voice, with power and participation in knowledge practices. It seeks to ensure that those who would otherwise be excluded or marginalized are able to articulate their standpoints and voices, and to give equal attention and recognition to all knowing agencies. And yet these mechanisms of inclusion or exclusion are not necessarily the result of targeted action and choices. They are inextricably bound up with the messiness of communication, with the multiple tensions, frictions, and interferences that characterize the exchange of signals across networks, channels, and communicative domains. Andrea Pavoni calls this the internal normativity of apparatuses. Every apparatus of seeing, she writes, is entangled with the process through which it enacts vision. That is, with the process through which it shapes how vision ought to be in order to be perceived as such. Hence, the suggestion is technical mediation creates its own internal normativity or regimes of intelligibility. Relayed back to the question of ethics and accountability in machine sensing and vision, this suggests that epistemic justice is not only contingent on the interpretative registers or the disciplinary conventions and methods used for anticipating and assessing risks or crises. It's also about how these methodological and discursive maneuvers articulate and are amplified or subdued by the materiality of communication, the technical standards or operational protocols, and the physical infrastructures of signal transmission that set the terms and conditions for translating and interpreting informational exchanges across human and non-human domains. These terms and conditions become particularly potent when we are confronted with entities that are no longer immediately present or that are unable to make their voices heard. This is precisely the challenge that climate researchers, border security agencies, and humanitarian activists face in their struggle to identify and track lives at risk or to prevent death at sea. Now, death is, of course, not a well-defined event with a clear boundary between absence and presence, beginning or end. Death is a paradigmatic state of liminality, oscillating between the animate and the inanimate, the material and the immaterial, human and non-human, that depends on historically specific determinations to delineate what counts as life, and in the name of who or what it is validated, defended, or recognized. Historically, as Nikhil Pal Singh suggests, these determinations have been used to establish critical caesuras between populations that appreciate one form of humanity for the purpose of another's health, development, or safety. Such distinctions predisposed some to group differentiated vulnerabilities of premature death, which Ruth Gilmore Wilson famously characterized as racism specific to colonial capitalist biopolitics. Now that such risks have reached a planetary scale, it becomes imperative to understand how such racialized determinations articulate to the extended field of sensibility afforded by machine vision. Without them, these risks will be impossible to fathom, or much less to contain. And so it's in this spirit that I want to show and further extend to what extent the planetary infrastructures for monitoring and protecting marine environments are made complicit in such racialized determinations of lives to be abandoned or sacrificed, in the very moment that they are mobilized to call long-standing assumptions of what constitutes life, and in the very moment they are calling the very distinction of what constitutes life and non-life into question, and break it or disrupt received distinctions between life, non-life, and death. The North Adriatic Sea has been identified as one of 400 dead zones considered to be under acute threat from human impacts. Industrial pollution, commercial shipping, overfishing, and climate change are literally suffocating the marine environment, disrupting vital food chains, oxygen supplies, and destroying the biodiversity of local habitats. The slow death of the marine ecosystem unfolds in the midst of a profound humanitarian crisis that has cost more than 20,000 migrant lives since 2014. The exact number is difficult to determine because there's no mechanism in place to systematically collect reliable data on the human death toll of irregular border crossings, at least not at sea. European states do not consider death outside their territorial waters as part of their sovereign responsibility and thus abstain from keeping any records. Civil society activists and intergovernmental organizations such as IOM, meanwhile, lack the resources and infrastructures to fill the information gap. The critical blind spot of knowledge about migrant death testifies to the marked uneven ways in which contemporary infrastructures of environmental sensing are currently mobilized in response to risk and vulnerabilities, threatening human and non-human organisms alike. Considering the abundance of data available on dying oceans and species or plastic waste, for example, one is left to wonder why the loss of human lives has so far escaped the attention of floating instrument platforms populating the Mediterranean Sea. If, as Alfonso Lingis suggests, responsibility is coextensive with our sensibility in our exposure to the world and to others, then the sensory affordances of computational infrastructures need to be considered as integral to the collective reciprocities at stake in our entanglement with non-human beings. They make us answerable to the group differentiated vulnerabilities of death and extinctions that are putting ever larger parts of the Earth system at risk. This is just one example of the very extensive area of instrument platforms such as Argo floats, drifting sensor points, and underwater gliders that are currently roaming the Mediterranean Sea. They are tasked with measuring rising sea levels, oceanic temperatures, salinity, and currents that are essential for modeling climate change. They are supported by Earth observation satellites, coastal webcams, unmanned aerial drones, and remotely operated underwater vehicles that continuously monitor and report critical gaps in the marine ecosystem and communicate back to land stations via orbiting satellites. The variables used to conduct these assessments are by no means self-evident or apparent. They are governed by a nested architecture of intergovernmental organizations and commissions, most notably the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission, IOC, and the UNESCO Framework for Ocean Observing, the Mediterranean Action Plan of the UN Environmental Programme, and the Mediterranean Commission on Sustainable Development. These organizations oversee the development of shared principles, guidelines, and indicators for monitoring and preserving the world oceans, which, in the specific context of the Mediterranean, culminated in an integrated monitoring and assessment plan, IMAP, for the Mediterranean. IMAP reflects a significant paradigm shift in Europe's approach to environmental policy and ocean governance. It combines evolutionary theory, oceanography, as well as marine social sciences and the humanities into a standardized framework that monitors biodiversity and non-indigenous species, pollution and marine litter, hydrography, all in an integrated manner for the first time. With this holistic approach, the integrated monitoring and assessment plan not only articulates an open commitment to the shared responsibilities for ensuring the health and survival of the sea and its ecosystems, it also produces the sea as a matter of concern and an address of legal and moral protection, implicitly recognizing the inextricable entanglement of human development with the well-being of the marine environment. Now, increasingly, these instrument platforms are also utilized for maritime security and border policing. The Police Directive for the European Border Management System, Eurosur, has been updated to strengthen the interoperability of military, environmental, and Earth observation systems, intimately connecting environmental protection and political control. The directive lays out a comprehensive strategy for information exchange between fishing and environmental agencies, the main Coast Guard and Border Security Authority Frontex, and the EU Earth Observation Programme, Copernicus. The general idea here is to integrate all this observational data into a centralized platform for risk analysis and situational reports that allow to monitor and disrupt irregular migration and smuggling at sea. As I've highlighted before, Frontex only concerns itself with migrants while still on the move, hoping to disrupt and return them to their states of origin. Its primary aims are not search and rescue operations, much less the retrieval of dead bodies at sea. This is left to civil society organizations and humanitarian actors who continue to roam around open waters so as to assist migrant vessels in need. In the early years of intensified migration movements up until 2014, Italian coast guards and the EU border security agencies did in fact conduct such rescue missions. But with the establishment of Frontex as a dedicated task force, the agency increasingly confined itself to missions of aerial surveillance, outsourcing the tedious work of intercepting and returning boats to Libyan or Tunisian coast guards and border security agencies of other African states. This enables Frontex to evade any direct contact with migrants that would obligate them to rescue or intervene in situations of crisis, and hence to prevent to be held accountable for their safety and security. My point here is that this push towards ever greater system integration in maritime domain awareness is indicative of the persistent hold of military logics over the infrastructures of scientific knowledge production. Where it was once ships that functioned as the main carriers of weapons and scientific instruments, it is today the vast network of Argo floats and drifting sensor points directly communicating with Earth observation satellites that bring scientific knowledge and warfare into inextricable embrace. This convergence of military, technical, and biological intelligence powerfully manifests what Gabris has called the becoming environmental of computation. Environments are made operational through sensors and instrument platforms, reconfiguring nature, the Earth, and its oceans into programmable entities. Mark Hansen, arguing in a similar vein, notes that this convergence of human and non-human sensory registers has fundamentally transformed the material foundations of perception, cognition, and experience. 21st century media, he writes, no longer address humans first and foremost, as cinema, television, or sound recording once did. They register the environmentality of the world itself, prior to and without any necessary relation with human affairs. Hence, what 21st century media in this view mediate is sensibility itself, or rather the material basis of sensory experience. Relayed back to the question of accountability and epistemic justice, this becoming environmental of sensory infrastructures and media demands a critical shift in the way we think the political and moral economy of scientific practices in relation to the state, law enforcement, and military operations, where questions of life and death have historically been mapped, measured, valued, and problematized. For if cognitive and affective registers are increasingly shaped by domains of operationality to which we have no direct mode of access, much less any direct means of control, where then should we situate the question of ethics with regards to knowledge and the values and meanings attached to life and how it becomes metabolized into discontinuities of life? To raise this question returns us back to the internal normativity, the material qualities of machine sensing and vision, and their situated effects. A brief look at how sensors communicate with their environment helps to understand the challenges at hand. Environmental sensors never capture the full spectrum of biophysical or biochemical properties and relations. When measuring salinity concentrations, for example, they only measure the electromagnetic activity running through seawater, which can then be converted into numerical values to be computed and visualized. Similar methods are used for measuring changing sea surface temperatures. Here, the amplitude of microwaves given off by the sea surface is used as the primary medium to extract information from open seas. The amplitude of micro wavelengths varies with temperature and salinity. These fluctuations then can then be recorded with highly sensitive radio receivers on Earth observation satellites. Most recently, European researchers started to analyze just one specific aspect of the sea surface radiation, known as reflectance. Reflectance is a technical term used in earth science to describe the amount of sunlight striking the earth that is reflected back into space. The pigments contained in sea plankton influence this reflectance, which leaves a unique fingerprint on the reflected sunlight. Thanks to machine learning and big data analytics, scientists have been able to identify the unique light signature of all 5 main types of phytoplankton and to map them back onto satellite updates. This allows to show the geographic distribution of toxic algae, for example, on a global scale for the first time. Ballestero has described this as a form of touching with light. Different wavelengths of the light spectrum touch upon the surfaces of sensors and inscribe textures in them. Each object manifests itself as a pattern of surfaces, a distinct grouping or topography. Ballestero's notion of touching with light powerfully evokes the figural tactics of remote sensing devices and machine vision. They enroll new spaces for configuring and evaluating life on the level of biophysical and biochemical processes and relations, in which the question of what counts as life and the timeframes and scales on which they should be evaluated and measured are no longer assumed as a priori given, but rather concrete in the very process of correlating wavelengths and concentrations of electrons into indicators and data textures that can then be algorithmically codified. Put differently, sensing technologies are never separate from, but deeply implicated in the material constitution of their own objects of observation. Sensory data always carries with it the material conditions of its own vision, extending its internal normativity or extending the internal normativity of Earth-observing media far beyond the surveillance gaze of the military or the state. This internal normativity encourages us to see Earth observation media, along with Yusuf and Bharat, as historically situated, metaforming, and embodied practices, in which the nonlinear transition between natural and premature death are enacted, negotiated, but also politicized in heterogeneous assemblages of human and non-human actors and knowing agencies. It's here, in this haptic, metaforming, meaning-making visuality of sensing technologies, where the thousands of unknown bodies drowned in the Mediterranean Sea expose a critical limit in the sensory affordances of Earth-observing media. They, on one hand, open up critical contact zones between humans and non-humans and their environment, raising awareness of their mutual responsibility, vulnerabilities, and obligations embedded in their openness to each other and their interdependency. At the same time, they create new possibilities for mis- or non-recognition and avoidance, as metabolic processes and relations are increasingly evaluated on the basis of textual patterns and behavioral attributes whose visibility, recognition, and intelligibility are contingent on the critical threshold between high and low resolution of images and data signals, and the availability and control over their reception and transmission across communicative domains. The lack of attention and knowledge about the thousands of unknown bodies drowned in the Mediterranean, in this sense, it exposes a critical limit in the sensory affordances of machine sensing, where new hierarchies of biolegitimacy are emerging and new patterns of racialization, dehumanization, and abandonment can take hold. These new patterns, I suggest, reveal an irreducible tension in the work of Earth-observing media. The tension of how to recognize the singularity of individual death in the face of total death that planetary infrastructures of Earth observation enable, and that are the direct result of the differential and selective ways in which geophysical and biochemical processes are captured and algorithmically codified. The ways in which migrants in distress have remained by and large invisible in the partial renderings of the Mediterranean calls for a radical rethinking of the technology of race as something more than skin color or biophysical essence. As Singh suggests, we need to recognize the technology of race as historical repertoires and cultural and spatial and signifying systems that stigmatize and depreciate one form of humanity for the sake of another's health and development and safety. Environmental sensing and Earth observation technologies, I suggest, need to be considered as a critical component of these signifying practices and systems. They facilitate a racialized politics of imperceptibility, whose exclusionary tactics, to follow Yusuf, have a critical bearing on the cohabitation of worlds. Recognizing their potential violence is of particular importance at this historical juncture, where the distinction between military and environmental infrastructures are becoming ever more difficult to ascertain, and their historical entanglements are ever more difficult to ignore. These entanglements unfold against a cultural backdrop that is deeply grounded in Cartesian divisions between science and politics, the laboratory and the political chamber, or the laws of nature and the laws of the state. Such divisions allow for a selective recognition of risks through technical mediation, whose particular violence manifests itself not only in the structural invisibility and misrecognition of certain bodies, but in the ways their death and disappearance are left unspecified and nondescript. Alan Feldman speaks of such targeted elisions as a containerization of war, to describe the perceptual and judicial blurring of military and scientific intelligence in digital platforms and warfare. Building on the work of Alan Sekula, containerization here denotes the offshoring of violence, in which war becomes the mode by which executive power is implanted and expands through the perceptual scattering of situational awareness, and that invests the foreclosure of public accountability by way of archival control. I'm citing Feldman here. The increasing convergence of military and scientific platforms for maritime surveillance are key drivers of this diffraction and outsourcing of violence into rarefied channels of computation. They facilitate select scenic affirmations of invisible threats on the basis of objectifying measures of biophysical and biochemical properties that diffuse and diffract racialized state power into a performativity of data textures and thus into the materiality of communication itself. Unlike the necropolitics described by Mbembe, this is a form of infrastructural war that does not work on objects or bodies directly. Rather, it operates through a technoscientific rendering and tactical elision that declassifies certain bodies and populations as proper to the terrestrial surface, denying them political exemplification and intelligibility. Relate back to the question of historical continuities in a more than human world, then, such acts of vanishment bring into relief how the planetary infrastructures for governing life and death implicate bio and geological processes in colonial logics that extend the idea of the border deep into the new context zones of nature cultures they themselves created, with the effect that some death can be naturalized, while nature is historicized into a material witness and archive for determining whose lives count and in the name of who or what it is defended, protected, and operationalized. So, and at this point, I think I stop. And I'm very excited and curious to hear your comments, critique, interventions, and thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Monika. This was an amazing talk, super rich, very dense. I took a lot of notes. I guess everybody tried the same. Can you just tell us briefly, is there a publication where for exactly referring to what you were telling us now?
Yes, I understand it's super tense, and I'm happy to share the article with you. It's published in two variants, but I share the book version. It's a book chapter on digital infrastructure in relation to Asia and the non-European world.